Peace, y'all. Welcome again on your payday. Welcome to CHUCG TALK, your favorite payday show.
Yeah.
You probably got a couple dollars in your account. Do your thing, pay your bills. Bless us with some lunch. Y'all posted that last week, but I already know y'all give it up. But welcome, though. Welcome again. I am Brother Lee. This is Brother Eric. We are here again yet for another episode of CHUCG TALK. And we're excited today. Today we're going to be talking about African-centered approaches to history and movements. And of course, before we dive into that, we got to come hard with the joke of the day. The joke of the day. And fortunately, y'all like how I did that. Fortunately, it's Lee's joke of the day. No, it's not a joke. I should have used
that was funny.
I should have used that as a joke.
Ain't that
Yeah. Seriously though. So the joke of the day is, and I want y'all to be very serious about this. Understand that this is very well thought out and very, a lot of effort has been put into it. The joke of the day is, what do you call a hot dog who's a movie star?
a chili dog?
No, that's a hot dog without a jacket. A hot dog who's a movie star is an Oscar winner. Oscar winner. Would y'all get an Oscar?
Yeah.
All right.
Oscar.
I thought that was good.
Oscar winner?
Oscar winner. So, yeah. Oh, man, please tell the crowd to quiet down back there. Please tell the crowd to quiet down.
That was funny, man. It was, I'll give you that one.
All right.
We had 2 good weeks, bro.
That's a solid week.
2 good shows.
Y'all stop acknowledging, too. Like, stop saying something like, dang, that was a good joke, fellas. Something seriously, because, like, my lungs is hurting from laughing at. All right, forget it. Y'all ain't going. All right, so that was a great way to start. That's good energy. That's our joke of the day, the Oscar winner. So let's go ahead. Let's dive into our topic again. It's African-centered approach to history and movements. So we're going to talk a little bit about that before we jump into our
Bell questions.
Y'all know what that sound is. Don't play games. Y'all know what that sound is. So, brother, you want to start, or you want to do?
Yeah. I'm excited about this. So I think I'll approach it in 2 ways, right? So
okay.
First, I'll talk about it in comparison to the different ways in which we are given the frameworks or the interpretive grid that we're given. You know what I'm saying?
I got
you. To understand history. So typically when you're in school, the one way that we understand history is through the analysis and storytelling around personalities, right? So when you start learning about the Civil War, they teach you a little bit about the larger macro history, but they spend a lot of time talking about Abraham Lincoln and all of the different players, you know what I'm saying? Robert E. Lee, all of these different folks who represent different aspects, and so they teach history through the lives of a person. I think that this kind of rendition of storytelling leans more toward the European-centered principle of individualism, right? So you learning about history and returning to the past and making that make sense only within the context of the past. You know what I'm saying? Like, there's this idea that, like, I think that the way that we're taught it essentially is like, oh, that happened a long time ago, and there isn't any impact of that history in the here and now, right?
That's very true.
So it's taught, like, history is taught, and reality, I should say, in the here and now is taught from an apolitical perspective. Like, you're just hearing stories, and not that those stories actually contribute to oppression or liberation or different social phenomena.
Absolutely.
So that's one aspect that African-centered understanding of history is a collective one, and one that looks at narrative through the collective story and through collective narratives, and not just through personalities. And I think specifically when we talk about movements, it's understanding movements or the history of movements from the perspective of the collective and from the perspective of, as one of the scholars, Baba, if you can see this book at the bottom, Blueprint for Black Power, give thanks for one of our ancestors, Dr. Amos Wilson. He talks about discontinuing, or as I would add, de-romanticizing our relationship with history, in so much that we're not just getting the good stories and being like, oh, my ancestors were so great, and recognize where their challenges, right? So from that standpoint, I think an African-centered way of looking at history is one that not only looks at the collective, but also when we're looking at movements that looks at strategy and not just the personalities, right?
Absolutely.
So like, not just, well, who was Malcolm X, or who was Muhammad Ali, or who was Paul Robeson, or who was Harriet Tubman, or who was Sojourner Truth. The question is, what work were they a part of? And then what strategies and tactics did they use? And then figuring out how they can be applied, you know what I'm saying, and employed in the here and now. And I think that gives us more understanding that personalities are part of intricate networks, and not just that you're learning from a person from a biological standpoint, but you're learning about the whole piece. And that, in my opinion, as we are doing movement building work, that's the type of approach to history that we have to, because then we understand legislation, we understand the economic situation during that time, what the politics were like, what social phenomena were around, and then why people responded in that. And beyond a documentary where somebody's narrating and telling you that they stood up for their rights, and they stood on the bus and they said, what's that song? Keep your eyes on the prize, oh Lord, right? And then they got the voice, right? And they got the voice. And then it's like, okay, cool, yes, and you feel good, and you're like, what do I do? You don't know, because they didn't teach you what the hell they did and the different pieces. So anyway, I'm going to be quiet there, but I think that this is why we need to unearth it, and this is why we need to take these approaches to understanding the collective and understanding strategy, especially for people who are interested in movement and organizing. You got to understand strategy and understand and be students of movements and students of the institutions and organizations that were part of the movements and the larger forces, and not just focus on the micro history of the personality. So I'm done.
No, that's major, man, because I think a lot of folks fall into that, like the micro history of the actual personality. But and really, my approach to it, or my perspective on it, is a lot more very similar to yours. But the African-centered approach is just a lot more unpacking, like you said, really just pulling back layers and actually considering circumstances, considering, like you said, the times, considering the challenges, and considering and being real and transparent about the stuff that didn't work. Like, you have to be that way. If you're doing movement, building movement, even the root word of that is move. You have to understand where you're moving and what's in front of you in order to make that move. If you're even 2 feet on the ground and there's a wall in front of you, you know you ain't moving today. Unless you somebody who can get through a wall.
No,
you know
that's real.
But just in general, I think that's the African-centered approach unpacks it a lot more. And then with that, you become more equipped. You become more, you have a larger understanding that's not just about your community, but the community that you've been involved with over time. And folks who may be similar to those communities going forward. And if not, those same communities don't pop out or arise, you'll see similar approaches. So it just gives you a very, I call history our best playbook, you know what I mean? And it's a playbook, but if anybody knows sports or anything that holds a playbook is a playbook unless you know how to use it, you know what I mean? You got to look at it, and you got to be able to see the things that other folks who don't understand playbooks can see. And it's that same thing when you want to, you know what I mean, interpret that to the team. And it's the same thing when you want to interpret it to the people when you're talking about movement, building, work. Understanding your playbooks, understanding all playbooks, understanding playbooks at large. So that's my main thing.
No, that's
my main
powerful,
thing.
bro.
That's my main
That's
thing.
powerful. I love that analogy of the playbook. One, because people can get to it, especially for those who are team players and played on sports, whether professionally or as amateurs growing up. And I think that, like what you said, I think your playbook can't work, one, unless you study and everybody know it, but until you practice it.
Exactly.
You know what I'm saying? You practice what you get good at.
Exactly.
If you practice complaining, you'll be a good complainer. If you practice working out your playbook, like that's what it's about.
Right.
For those who, man, remember me and you, folks don't know outside of this, you know what I'm saying? We actually, you know, I'll tell y'all a secret. I don't really mess with y'all for real. I just work with them. It's like, nah. But on the real, we get a chance to hang out and have some thoughtful conversations. Absolutely. One of the things we talked about was the documentary that was done, Last Dance, about Chicago Bulls, right? And we talked about, like, yo, people ain't see the moments.
Kind of transparency, right?
People ain't.
That's real history. That's history that happened.
That's real.
And it's like, it's so many pieces of that we had no clue about. And now, even not to get away from the topic, but even thinking about Jordan in that way, we all have our own perspectives until you see a why, or until you see what was going on that made him do or be how they were.
Larger context.
You know what I mean?
They did a good job with that docu-series as well, because they showed,
it was
like,
deep.
Michael Jordan didn't win those championships.
No.
Now everybody know he was a superstar, but he wasn't. He lost for 8 years or something. It was like 8 years before.
He got beat. Let's be clear.
Yes.
Like Detroit gave him Detroit changed that man to never be the same ever again. You know what I mean? So,
and granted, it wasn't from an African-centered standpoint, but I think it did a good job of unpacking the layers.
Yeah.
So you see all the
just
pieces.
that approach, right?
You know what I'm saying? So and that's the other thing too. We're not by asserting African-centered approaches to history, to learning history, being students of history, and being students of movements, as saying that learning about a personality, a person is wrong.
Right.
It's just that the centralized focus on the so-called individual is problematic because then you lose a lot of stuff.
Yes.
But with that being said, from that documentary, I know we got to move on. It was clear that Michael Jordan couldn't win without somebody that you probably never would hear about, like Steve Kerr or Bill Cartwright, or unless you like deep in Bulls history like I was growing up, B.J. Armstrong.
And that's history.
Like all of these
you got people who are in
it.
it. Then you got people who just get what they can get out of it. And
you're talking about a losing team with a superstar until they get this mastermind coach who learned it from somebody else, right? When you got the whole picture, then you're like, here are the pieces that you can plug in.
And
all
I know what I mean. So that might change their approach for people who think they might got losing teams. You know what I mean? Because you never know. So that's one way to go about it. But
we can talk about that. That's another topic. That's a topic that we can talk about.
All right, so it's time. It's time. And we are about to do our... Oh, the batteries ran out. The battery. I'm sorry, y'all.
His fingers
There we go. A little grease on the fingers. That's the bell questions. Ding right there. I'm gonna get you one more time. Here we go. So let's get started. We got some good bell questions. Our first one is from Jared. Hopefully not Jared from Subway. Our first one is, why do we see history or narratives from a perspective of conflict, i.e. villain versus hero? That's really good.
You can take that one first.
I would love to go first. So, all right. So I take a step back. Recently, we did just some political education, digital approach, if you will. We did a watch party that talked about Baba Malcolm, and Baba King, and talked about how their approaches were different and similar, and how we got to this place of like, who's better than who. Right? So I think naturally, to be completely honest, this is my philosophical approach, if you will. I think people, when you get these kinds of personalities that arise out of a group and they become these level of leaders, I think naturally, for anything, I think we fall into a space where we compare them. But I also think...
that still happens to this day.
Oh, it's going to happen.
J. Cole, Kendrick.
You ain't going to be able to get out. And Nate, you talking about all greats. You talking about all greats, but you're not going to be able to get away from... You know what I mean? So
Foxy Brown, Lil Kim.
I don't think that's the issue. I think... So this is my problem. And I think that's fine. I think that's what's going to happen. We are, as humans, I guess, if you will, there has to be some kind of alpha to some situation for us, most of the time, if you will. But I don't think that's the problem. I think the problem is we have not done a good job of diving into the kinds of histories and like we just talked about, unpacking everything, but also what's necessary and what are we dealing with, right? So you got these two different approaches to a path to liberation, and you got folks who are on one side and think the other side has nothing to do with that side, and then you got folks vice versa on the other side. When really there's correlations to be made, and there's a path in between these two paths that both of Baba Malcolm and Baba King have both zeroed in and understood on and knew what the goal was. It's just different approaches, if you will.
There you go.
But it goes back to what we talked about with the playbook. You got to unpack those approaches, and I think the last piece I'm gonna say before I let you jump in. You talk about villain versus hero. You got to first understand that we stand on the playbook analogy one more time. When you go back and you dive into whose practices were better, two folks dealing with two different scenarios at two different times under two different circumstances. You know what I mean? And that's the same thing with leaders in anything that we have today. Even you think about your boxers, who's the greatest boxer, you're gonna have extra stuff to say about a Floyd Mayweather than you would to have to say about a Sugar Shane Mosley or something like that, right? So, but the last piece I want to say is that if you take a step back and dive into the actual narratives of the folks of the leaders, you'll understand that you can't be married to these approaches. They have not made these approaches for you to be married to. It's kind of like your grandmother passing down that recipe.
Yeah.
She give you that recipe on how to make crab cakes, if you will. We in Baltimore, gotta go for the crab cakes. She give you that recipe on how to make crab cakes. That recipe it may not stay the same forever. You know what I mean? It may come a time where we talked about you have to make some adjustments for your own health.
Right.
You can't use that much salt no more.
Right.
So you can't. And now, granted, you're not throwing away the recipe, but
Right.
you're evolving it. And I think it's the same thing with these narratives. But I think we have to do a better job of studying, understanding, and we just talked about unpacking our leaders and what they've stood for, and really understanding and doing as much research as we can on their words verbatim, and really being able to say this approach is necessary here, this approach is necessary here, or we can infuse or mesh these two approaches together, and this is what the adjustments we can make, and this is going to work for us because they started that train already. So that's my I guess that's my take on it. Bro.
Yeah, man. No, you nailed that, and I think that's strong. That's a strong analysis, and for me, I would continue that by just re-emphasizing something that you alluded to earlier is context.
Mm-hmm.
We got to be able to understand, be students within context,
ignorant without it,
knowing that if you are studying the civil rights movement. And you see that there are these two personalities that represent two approaches. They're not their approaches. In fact, if you study deeply Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., you would understand that he got his approach from tailoring an approach that came from Mahatma Gandhi.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Satyagraha.
Yeah.
You would learn about civil disobedience. Who Gandhi got it from Henry David Thoreau and other scholars who wrote about it and used it, right? But when you talked about your grandmother giving the recipe and you changing it, it has everything to do with context. Right. I don't like to give this example a lot and lift up, white folks in this way, but I think it's strong. Mm-hmm. One of who they call the grandfather or the godfather, whatever, of community organizing, Saul Alinsky. One thing that he talked about, particularly even with what's the brother's name? I just said it, Mahatma Gandhi, that they used the tactics that were readily available for them. Mm-hmm. Their enemy at that particular time, where they were doing civil disobedience and doing the fasting and all of that stuff, it was because you were fighting against the English government. Right. You wasn't gonna get guns. Now, if they didn't have enough guns, what approach would you take?
Exactly.
Get guns.
You gotta switch it. Exactly.
You feel me? So it's about context.
Always.
And so I think that you're absolutely right in that, man. I think that really understanding. In fact, I think it's just my opinion. That is actually not smart to not think about context because then we trying to sit here and be the 21st century Malcolm X and we sitting here looking crazy, right? Exactly. Like I had this one thing one time, I know you know about it because I sent it to you. I was joking, I had gelled my hair down and I said I wanted the Detroit Red, right? And the gel down was the part, right? We should, right? And I think the reason I bring that up is because we sitting up here trying to be a 1960s person who passed in 1960, and if he was around in 2020, he wouldn't even be the 1960 version, right? And so the thing is, I feel like one of the things that, not only context that we got to be aware of, but I also think that it's like something that we have to think about is that, as you mentioned already, approaches are just approaches. They're not meant to be like, all right, well, exactly. So this is my approach. This is what I got to stand to. That's who I am. In fact, your goal is not liberation if you see it that way.
There you go.
We just had a session earlier this week, real impromptu, where delineating the difference between political theory and political practice or political praxis.
Absolutely.
And you're talking about, there are theories that we can operate, but in real life, all those aspects of a theory might not be applicable, or it might not be applicable in a certain time. And so one of the things that I want to dismantle, particularly when we're talking about movements, it is not a movement unless it is coordinated. It's not a movement if it's not based on relationships. It's not a movement if there is not a change goal. And change goals with an S. And when I say coordination and relationship and change goal, that requires strategy. There is absolutely no movement without strategy. So if you got something and a couple people putting hashtags on it, that don't make it a movement.
There you go.
You feel me?
There you go.
When we talk about movements, we're talking about understanding where people identified a common enemy and a common issue and then created the type of approaches to create the solutions that folks decided that they want.
Yeah.
And that has everything to do with, being, flexible. If you read The Art of War, you would recognize that you got to take different approaches because you have to know your terrain. So if you're fighting on the mountains, your approach is going to be different when you get to the valley. If you get to the water, your approach is going to be different when you get to the water. So we have to understand that, but we have to be always vigilant about it. And I know a couple of shows ago we talked about praxis, last episode we talked about praxis, reflection and action. Reflection allows us to think about, we're moving to the water now. Our water tactic now is in place, but it's a part of the same strategy, right? So that to me, I think when we talk about different approaches, that's one part of it. But also I think that the European-centered way of understanding movements and histories is really it's like you can't tell a story without a villain and a hero. It's like you look at Disney.
Not a story, not a movie.
You feel me?
It's what it's
always a protagonist and an
I can't fault them for, you know what I mean? It's been pounded. It's been trained on, you know what I mean? But if I can just add one thing before we jump to our next bell question, I just want to say this very clearly for you all, and this is for everybody who's tuned in or not tuned in. Knowledge without context will leave you handicapped. Please understand that. Knowledge with any kind of, I don't care what it is, what you're up to, or what you're in, or what your craft is. Any knowledge without the context, you cannot make a reliable, responsible decision. You will be handicapped. You are not. You don't have all the pieces you need. You have to go and get everything. You can't build a whole puzzle out. If there's one piece missing out that box, the puzzle is pointless. Yeah, it's that simple.
That's real.
Yeah, let me jump to this next question.
That was good stuff. That was actually really
Our next one. So, Sharice. Okay, so what are some approaches that seem relevant for today? What are some approaches that seem relevant for today?
For me, I guess I would first say, well, what are we talking about?
That's what I'm about to say. You got to decide
for today.
Exactly.
And I mean, I'll take the liberty to decipher what we might make.
That's what I was about to say. You had to pick.
I think the one thing that I hope that we do, and I want to lift up if folks haven't seen it, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle here in Baltimore hosted a panel, a Zoom panel, or an online panel about building community institutions and institution building. And that's the thing. And that's how I'm choosing to respond to it. Something is in my eye right now. White supremacy in my eye. Oh, wow. So,
got no black napkins over here.
You ain't got no black napkins. Yeah. So anyway, in that talk, they talked about, in the context of the conversation about defunding the police, the conversation is not as pervasive, if you will, talking about building community institutions. And so for me, I think when we're thinking about different approaches, I think my generic answer would be that one approach to understanding history and being students of history is just, in general, it's just read everything. Yeah. Baba Malcolm actually said that. Yes. He said, read everything you can get your hand on. And I want to emphasize that means not everything you agree with, everything you can get your hand on. In fact, both approaches. What I learned from Baba Martin is that when we're talking about, you have to be able to know the antithesis to your position. Yes. So for those who don't understand antithesis, I'm going to assume that double word Scrabble word, double letter Scrabble word. Antithesis just means the other side of it, right? So you got to be.
That's really good. Double word Scrabble word.
I got that from Brother Mike.
That's really
Rich
good.
Mike, Big Mike. Shout out.
My God.
But the antithesis just means the other side of your position, right? So if your position is that Black people deserve to build our own institutions because we are like fish out of water in white institutions, then you got to think about what the opponent is going to be in the opponent's position, thinking about somebody's position if they said, well, white institutions have worked for you this long, why you got a problem? Right. So you need to be able to argue their position better than you can argue your own position, right? Yeah. In so much that you need to beat them to the punch when they say what they say. I learned these skills from debate. I give thanks for my experience as a debater in high school. But I think that that's the thing, being able to understand arguments, whether you agree with them or not, and being able to have on both sides, being the affirmative and being on the other side, perpetuating the status quo or going against the status quo. And I think that with that being said, if we read everything and we understand it, then I think that all the approaches are available for us to figure out how to build our own institutions. Approaches that consider legislative change, approaches that consider building black institutions, approaches that consider being separated from white folks and white institutions, approaches that look like violence, approaches that look like they're peaceful. But I think that we cannot, pigeonhole ourselves into specific approaches, but that's where I would say, because I think that there are different ways to do it. And as we talked about in the last question, even with our work of moving toward black land and food sovereignty in Baltimore, and hopefully throughout the African diaspora, supporting that work with our other folks, our other comrades, I think that the best way to do it is to learn what's out there. Like there isn't one approach that I say you should take or approaches that exist. there are tons of approaches.
So many approaches.
Historical and contemporary ones, but that requires us to build relationships. That requires us to read. You know what I'm saying? Read Blavity articles. Read Civil Eat articles. There are tons of stuff in print media, podcasts, YouTube, to consider all of the approaches for black liberation. You know what I'm saying? Absolutely. And there are tons of them. So I would suggest just read and go after. But then after we do that, have these kind of spaces where we can talk about our reflections, and then we can give our approaches to it.
Move forward,
One thing I will promote real quick, Dr. Claude Anderson wrote a book called Powernomics. I know I talked about it last time. I feel like that's a must read for everybody who want to build power.
Y'all got homework.
Like for real. Everybody, if you think you want to build power for black people in this country, let's read that book. And I ain't saying it like it's the Bible or I agree with everything, because I ain't gonna lie to y'all. Maybe this is blasphemous, but I don't believe everything that happened, or I don't agree with everything that happened in the Bible.
It's not blasphemy.
You feel me?
Yeah.
So for me, it's like, at least that's a place for us to start. You know what I'm saying?
That's
and I think that one of the things that we have to absolutely need to do as an approach is undo what we've learned and do anew with the reading, with the studying together, and acting on the world together. Right.
No, really, man, and mine's maybe a little bit shorter, but only because I'm really just in complete agreement. If I had to say anything, and I was going to say in this order specifically, but I would just say the first approach we need to worry about is just the undoing piece, right? Because we perpetuate a lot of white supremacy that we don't even know, and then we've been also, and I want to be clear that it's not our fault. We've been trained by these systems in so many ways in our workplaces, in our jobs, in our society about how to operate inside of any other place as an individual civilian. All of these things perpetuate things that have been given to us, and we've been forced to kind of be groomed by. So there's a lot of undoing. I use this analogy all the time of like having your shoes tied, right? When you're growing up, you don't know how to tie your shoes, right? All this time, somebody's tying them for you. Then it comes that day where you got to figure it out. And it's like, the first thing you got to do before you figure out how to tie anything is unloosen your own shoestrings and be able to go back and be like, all right, I'm going to start with the bunny ears this time. I know we didn't use it last time, but you know what I mean? So that's one thing. But following that, and I'm borrowing this from ancestor Baba Thomas Sankara. That's how they actually pronounce Thomas Sankara. But brother built or worked to build as president so much for the community, and it was so much insourcing versus having to outsource. And I want to be clear that doesn't mean you don't have to outsource. It doesn't mean you don't have to have partners. That means you have to be strategic. That means you have to have the context. That means you have to understand how the people before you, the playbook, what the playbook says, how to use them to move forward, to push a movement forward yourself. And it's like you understand how to use the help. You're not going to get there alone. And I've seen that time and time again in every other movement. There has been an ally. There's always going to be an ally. But understand what an ally is. Understand how allies have been used in the past as well. But that's my approach. And I think I just think those two things are right now going to go hand in hand and maybe not get us to the final vehicle, because I know we got a lot more work to do, but it's going to get us near a car, in the car, if you will, if we start with those two. That's my take on it.
Can I just say one thing just to bring that point together? I said something earlier about political theory versus political practice, and that's it. Like thinking about the building of Burkina Faso, that's the difference between political practice and political theory. It's like, where are my principles, and then building off.
By any means,
because you couldn't build a country without working with others. You had to.
By any means, and that means being uncomfortable when you don't want to be uncomfortable. That also means saying forget the help that you don't want. You know what I mean? Because it comes with some kind of circumstance. And like it's a lot to it.
No,
but
that's real.
While we could keep going over and over again into more and more episodes today, we aren't going to. Please tune in on July 24th. We'll talk about the invisibility of white supremacy. Can you see it? Can you see it? Can you see it? Yeah, get it. Invisibility.
We can't see.
Yes. Yes. Please follow us at Black Yield on Instagram. Also at Black Yield on Twitter and at Black Yield on Facebook. Send us bell questions, please, as many as you can. Show us some love, and we'll see y'all next time.
Peace.
Peace.